The billionaire thought his maid was ugly. But when she removed her veil, he couldn't believe his eyes. Everything took a shocking turn. She had worked in that mansion for 2 years, and not once, not a single time, had anyone seen her face. They called her the veiled maid behind her back. They whispered that she was hiding a scar. They whispered that she was hiding something worse. But on the night of the biggest party of the year, in front of every powerful guest in the city, her veil came off, and the room went silent. What Julian Cross saw in that moment didn't just change his life. It changed everything he thought he knew about the woman who had been cleaning his house, guarding a secret bigger than his entire fortune. Hey, before we get into this one, I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop your country in the comments. I read every single one of them. This story is about pride, hidden pain, and a truth that stayed buried for far too long. It's emotional, it's heartbreaking in places, and it ends in a way I promise you won't see coming. So get comfortable, because this is one you're going to want to watch until the very last second. The chandeliers in the Cross mansion were the first thing anyone noticed. Then came the marble floors, the wraparound staircase, the smell of fresh flowers that never seemed to wilt because someone was always replacing them before they could. It was the kind of house where wealth wasn't announced, it just existed, quietly, in every corner. Naomi Hart had learned to move through that house like a shadow. She woke before sunrise, made sure the kitchen was spotless before the cook arrived, folded the morning newspapers into perfect thirds, and disappeared into whatever room needed her before anyone important noticed she'd been there at all. She wore the same thing every day, a plain grey uniform, low shoes that didn't make noise on the marble, and a soft cream-coloured veil that covered the lower half of her face, tied neatly behind her head. Nobody in the house had ever asked her to explain the veil, not directly. It had simply become part of who she was to them. The other staff assumed it was a scar from a car accident, or a burn, or something she was too embarrassed to talk about. A few of the newer maids had made jokes about it in the break room, jokes that stopped the second they realized Naomi could hear every word through the thin kitchen door. She never corrected them. She never explained. She just kept working. Julian Cross, the man who owned the mansion, the man whose name was on 3 buildings downtown and 1 hospital wing, barely knew she existed. At 34, he ran Cross Industries the way his father had taught him, with total focus and almost no patience for distractions. Staff were staff. He nodded at them in hallways. He said good morning out of habit, not warmth. His fiancée, Vanessa Sterling, 33, elegant and sharp-tongued, ran the household with the same cold efficiency she used to run her family's charity foundation. Which was to say, she ran it like a business, and she did not like surprises. It was Vanessa who had hired Naomi 2 years earlier. It was Vanessa who had set one very specific rule the day Naomi started. The veil stays on. Always. No exceptions. Naomi had found the rule strange at the time, but she needed the job badly enough that she didn't ask questions. She'd learned, over the years, that some rules existed for reasons that had nothing to do with fairness. That morning, the house was buzzing. In 3 days, the Cross Industries Foundation Gala would fill the ballroom with senators, old money families, and half the business elite of the city. Vanessa had been planning it for months, walking through the halls with a clipboard, snapping orders about flower arrangements and seating charts like a general preparing for battle. Naomi. Vanessa's voice cut through the hallway like a blade. Naomi straightened immediately, hands folded in front of her apron. You'll be working the gala. Serving, not mingling. And the veil stays on the entire night. Do you understand me? No matter who asks. No matter what happens. Yes, Naomi said quietly, her voice muffled slightly by the fabric. Vanessa studied her for a moment longer than necessary, something unreadable flickering behind her eyes, and then walked away without another word. Naomi stood alone in the hallway for a second, staring at the enormous oil painting hanging above the staircase, a portrait of Julian's father, Thomas Cross, painted decades earlier when the company was still young and hungry. Beside him in the painting, slightly out of focus, almost erased by time and dust, stood another man. Someone the current staff never asked about. Someone whose name had quietly disappeared from every plaque in the building. Her father. Naomi looked at that painting every single day. And every single day, she reminded herself why she was really there, and it had nothing to do with cleaning floors. By the time she reached the kitchen, her hands were trembling slightly, though no one would have noticed under her gloves. 3 days. In 3 days, everything she'd spent 2 years building toward would either fall into place or fall apart completely. Julian Cross had a habit his assistant liked to tease him about. He noticed details in spreadsheets before he noticed them in people. He could catch a single misplaced decimal point in a 40-page financial report from across a conference table. But he'd walked past the same housekeeper for 2 years without ever really looking at her. That changed, slowly, without him quite realizing it, about a week before the gala. He'd stayed late in his study going over old company files, a habit he'd picked up recently, ever since his father's health had started declining and Julian had taken on the task of digitizing decades of paper records nobody had touched since the 90s. Buried in a box marked MISC, Archive, he found a photograph that stopped him cold. 2 men, young, maybe in their late 20s, standing in front of a half-built warehouse, both grinning like they'd just won something enormous. One of them was unmistakably his father, Thomas Cross, decades younger, dark-haired, full of the kind of confidence that hadn't yet been polished into corporate ruthlessness. The other man Julian didn't recognize at all. He flipped the photo over. Written on the back, in fading pencil, T. Cross and R. Whitfield, the day everything started. Never forget who believed in you first. Whitfield. The name meant nothing to Julian. And that, somehow, felt wrong. If this man had been standing beside his father on the day the company began, why had Julian never once heard the name in 34 years? He asked his father about it the next morning, during one of their brief phone calls. Thomas Cross's voice, weaker now than it used to be, went strangely quiet on the other end of the line. "Where did you find that photo?" his father asked, his tone sharper than Julian expected. "In the archive boxes." "Who was he, Dad?" "Robert Whitfield." A long pause. Then, "That's a long time ago, son. A business partner. It didn't end well. Leave it alone." Julian didn't leave it alone. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the strange tightness in his father's voice, or maybe it was simply that he'd spent his whole life being told the family story only ever went one direction, straight up, built entirely by Thomas Cross's brilliance alone. No mention of a partner. No mention of anyone else's sacrifice. That same week, something else started nagging at him, something smaller, almost embarrassing to admit. He'd started noticing the veiled maid. Not because of her face, which he'd never seen. It was her eyes. Sharp, alert, always watching the room like she was cataloguing something. Once, walking past the study, he saw her pause in front of that same portrait of his father, the one with the half-erased man standing beside him, and stand there for nearly a full minute before catching herself and hurrying away. It was such a small moment. He almost dismissed it entirely. Almost. 2 nights before the gala, Julian worked late again, and found himself in the kitchen at nearly midnight, looking for coffee. Naomi was there, alone, quietly organizing serving trays for the event. She startled when she saw him, straightening immediately, veil in place, posture perfect. "Mr. Cross. I didn't realize you were still awake." "Just getting coffee," he said, and then, before he could stop himself, "You've worked here 2 years, right?" "Yes, sir." "I don't think I know your last name." Something shifted behind her eyes, so brief he almost missed it. "Hart," she said. "Naomi Hart." He nodded slowly, filing the answer away without quite knowing why it mattered. "Well, good night, Ms. Hart." "Good night, sir." He left the kitchen with his coffee, and Naomi stood frozen for a long moment after the door closed behind him, one hand pressed flat against the counter, breathing carefully, like someone who had just walked past a landmine without stepping on it. 2 more days, she told herself. Just 2 more days, And either the truth comes out on her terms, or Vanessa Sterling makes sure it never comes out at all. The night of the gala arrived wrapped in gold light and violins. 300 guests filled the Cross Mansion ballroom, senators in tailored suits, old money widows dripping in inherited jewelry, tech founders trying too hard to look casual in $6,000 blazers. Vanessa Sterling moved through the crowd like she'd been built for exactly this, laughing at the right moments, touching elbows, steering conversations toward donations for the foundation. Julian stood near the champagne fountain, half listening to a senator discuss infrastructure bills, his eyes drifting across the room out of habit. That was when he saw her. Naomi moved along the edges of the party the way staff were trained to, invisible, efficient, refilling glasses before anyone noticed they were empty. Her veil was in place exactly as instructed. But something about the way she carried herself tonight was different. Straighter. Steadier. Like a person walking toward something instead of away from it. It happened near the grand staircase, close to 11 o'clock, in front of at least 60 guests. An elderly woman in a deep emerald gown, Eleanor Ashworth, one of the city's oldest and most respected philanthropists, a woman who had known the Cross family since before Julian was born, reached out and gently caught Naomi's wrist as she passed with a tray. "Wait," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly. "Wait, your eyes. My God. Say something. Please, say something to me." Naomi froze. I. That voice. Eleanor's hand rose slowly toward the veil, not with cruelty, but with something closer to disbelief. "It can't be. Robert's daughter. You're Robert Whitfield's daughter, aren't you? You're little Naomi." The room, which had been humming with 100 quiet conversations, began to still. Vanessa's head turned sharply from across the ballroom, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. "Please," Naomi whispered, stepping back. "Please, not like this." But it was already happening. Eleanor, driven by decades of grief and disbelief, reached forward with trembling hands and gently lifted the veil away. Gasps rippled outward across the ballroom, not because of a scar, not because of anything disfigured or broken. There was no wound underneath. There never had been. Beneath the veil was a face that was, simply, beautiful. Striking cheekbones, warm brown eyes now filled with tears, a face that Eleanor Ashworth clearly recognized from somewhere deep in her memory. "It's you," Eleanor breathed. "It's really you. We thought your family disappeared after Robert passed. We thought," Vanessa told everyone your family moved away, "that there was nothing left to." "Eleanor." Vanessa's voice sliced through the ballroom, suddenly beside them, her face pale beneath her makeup. "I think you're confused. This is one of the household staff." "I'm not confused," Eleanor snapped, drawing herself up with the full authority of a woman who had outlived 3 husbands and built half the charity boards in the city. "I held this child at her christening, Vanessa. I know exactly who I'm looking at." Julian had crossed the room without realizing he was moving. He stood now directly in front of Naomi, staring at her face for the first time in 2 years, and something in his chest cracked open. Not romantic, not yet, but something closer to recognition, like meeting someone from a dream he couldn't quite remember. "Whitfield," he said slowly. "Robert Whitfield's daughter." Naomi's eyes, still wet, lifted to meet his. "Yes," she said, her voice finally steady. "My name is Naomi Whitfield. My father built this company beside yours, Mr. Cross. And 2 years ago, I came here under a different name, because I needed to find out exactly what happened to everything my family lost." Behind Julian, Vanessa's face had gone the color of paper. For nearly 10 seconds, nobody in the ballroom moved. Then the whispers started, low and electric, spreading outward from the staircase like ripples on water. "Whitfield. The Whitfield girl. I thought that family lost everything years ago." Julian felt the ground shift under him in a way that had nothing to do with the marble floor. "I don't understand," he said quietly, only to Naomi now, the rest of the room fading into background noise. "My father never mentioned a partner. There's no Whitfield name anywhere in the company records. Nothing. There used to be, Naomi said. My father's name was on the original incorporation papers. 40% ownership, in exchange for the capital that got this company off the ground when your father had nothing but an idea and a warehouse he couldn't afford. That's not possible. I've read every founding document. There's no 40% unaccounted for. Because it disappeared, Naomi said, and for the first time, her carefully controlled voice cracked slightly. My father died when I was 19. Heart attack, sudden, no warning. Within 6 months, our family's shares in this company had vanished from every record. My mother was told there had never been a formal partnership, just a friendly loan that had already been repaid. We had no lawyers, no money to fight it, and grief enough to drown in. We lost the house. My mother got sick from the stress within 2 years and never really recovered. I finished college working 3 jobs and telling myself, someday, I would find out exactly what happened to my father's share of this company. Vanessa, who had been standing frozen through this entire exchange, suddenly found her voice sharp and defensive. This is absurd. Julian, you can't possibly believe a member of the cleaning staff is going to stand here and rewrite 30-year-old business history at your engagement gala. Nobody said anything about rewriting history, Naomi said, turning to face her directly for the first time, veil now hanging loose around her neck. I said I came here to find out the truth. And 2 years of quietly working in this house, quietly going through old files whenever I had access, has shown me something very interesting, Ms. Sterling. Your family's law firm, Sterling and Wade, was the firm that handled the paperwork the year my father's shares disappeared. The color that had already drained from Vanessa's face went further, into something closer to gray. That is a coincidence, Vanessa said quickly. My father's firm handled hundreds of contracts that year. Maybe, Naomi said quietly. Or maybe that's exactly why you insisted I keep my face covered every single day I worked in this house. Because you recognized my last name the day I applied for this job, and you were terrified someone else might recognize my face. Eleanor Ashworth, still standing close by, folded her arms with the grim satisfaction of a woman who had just watched a puzzle click into place after 30 years. Well, she said, to no one in particular but loud enough for half the ballroom to hear. This is certainly turning into the most interesting gala I've attended in a decade. Julian looked between the 2 women, his fiancée, elegant and suddenly unraveling in front of 300 witnesses, and Naomi, trembling but standing perfectly straight, having just detonated a truth she'd clearly been carrying alone for 2 exhausting years. I need everyone to give us the room, Julian said finally, his voice carrying the same authority he used in boardrooms, except now it was shaking slightly at the edges. Now, please. The gala did not end that night so much as it fractured, quietly, guest by guest slipping toward the exits while whispering behind raised hands. And in the sudden quiet of the emptying ballroom, Naomi Whitfield stood facing the 2 people who controlled the only proof that might finally explain what happened to her family. One of whom looked at her now with something like wonder, and the other who looked at her like a woman staring down a countdown clock she could no longer stop. By 1 in the morning, the mansion had emptied of guests, waitstaff, and caterers, leaving only Julian, Naomi, and Vanessa in the study. The same study where Julian had first found the photograph a week earlier. Vanessa had recovered some of her composure, arms crossed, chin lifted in the particular way people use when they're deciding how much of the truth they can afford to admit. Julian, she said carefully, before you do anything rash, I want you to remember who's been standing beside you for the last 3 years. Whatever happened with the Whitfield family's shares happened before I was even out of law school. This has nothing to do with me. Then explain the veil, Julian said flatly. He was standing near the old portrait of his father, arms folded, studying Vanessa with the cold, forensic focus he usually reserved for hostile takeovers. You hired her. You made one rule, and one rule only, that her face stayed covered every single day, no exceptions. Why would you do that if her identity meant nothing to you? Vanessa hesitated a fraction too long. I recognized her when she applied, she admitted finally. Fine. Yes. I recognized the last name immediately. Whitfield isn't exactly a common name in this city's business circles, not after everything that happened. I was curious. I wanted to keep an eye on her without causing unnecessary drama. Unnecessary drama, Naomi repeated quietly, her voice tight. You made me hide my own face in the house my father helped build, and you're calling it avoiding drama. I was protecting this family's reputation, Vanessa snapped. Or protecting yourself, Julian said. Silence dropped over the room like a curtain. Julian crossed to his desk and pulled open the bottom drawer, retrieving a thin folder he'd started keeping since the night he found the photograph. Inside were copies of incorporation documents he'd requested from the company archives that week, before any of this had happened, driven purely by a nagging curiosity he hadn't yet understood. I had our records department pull the original 1991 incorporation filing 3 days ago, he said. Before tonight. Before any of this. Just because a photograph bothered me. He laid the papers on the desk. There's a signature block for a second founding partner. It's blank. Erased, actually. You can see the ghost of where a name used to be typed before someone ran it through a copier one too many times to fade it out. Naomi's breath caught. I don't know who did that, Julian continued, looking directly at Vanessa now, but I know Sterling and Wade handled our corporate filings exclusively from 1989 until your father retired in 2003. And I know that whoever altered this document had access to both the original paperwork and the legal authority to refile it without raising questions. You're accusing my father of fraud, Vanessa said, her voice rising. A man who is not even here to defend himself. I'm not accusing anyone yet, Julian said. I'm telling you what the paper trail shows. And I'm telling you that as of tonight, I intend to find out exactly what happened to Robert Whitfield's 40%, no matter whose name ends up attached to the answer. Vanessa stared at him for a long moment, something calculating moving behind her eyes, and then she straightened her shoulders and reached for her coat. Fine. Dig all you want. But when you find nothing but an old clerical error from 30 years ago, don't come to me expecting an apology for tonight's humiliation. She swept out of the room, heels sharp against the marble, leaving the study feeling suddenly much quieter than before. Julian exhaled slowly and turned to Naomi, who was still standing near the doorway, arms wrapped around herself like she was holding something together by sheer will. 2 years, he said softly. You worked in my house for 2 years, hiding your face, cleaning up after people who never once wondered who you really were. Why didn't you just come to me directly? Why all of this? Naomi's eyes filled again, but her voice stayed steady. Because the last time my family trusted the cross name, she said, we lost everything. I needed to see the truth for myself, from the inside, before I trusted anyone with it again. Even you. Julian poured 2 glasses of water, set one in front of Naomi, and sat down across from her at the small reading table near the study window. Outside, the last of the caterers' vans pulled away down the long driveway, headlights sweeping briefly across the room before disappearing into the dark. Tell me everything, he said. From the beginning. I want to understand. Naomi wrapped both hands around the glass without drinking, staring into it like it might give her the courage to start. My father was an engineer, she said finally. Brilliant, but broke. He met your father at a trade conference in 1988, back when Thomas Cross was still trying to convince banks to fund a manufacturing idea nobody believed in. My father believed in it. He put in almost everything he had, his savings, a loan against his parents' house, in exchange for 40% ownership of what would eventually become Cross Industries. I grew up hearing the stories, she continued. How they built the first warehouse together with their own hands because they couldn't afford contractors. How my father used to say your father had the vision, but he had the stubbornness to make sure the vision actually got built. They were partners in every real sense of the word, even after the company grew bigger than either of them probably imagined. Then what happened? Julian asked quietly. My father died of a sudden heart attack when I was 19. No warning, no illness, just gone overnight. Her voice thinned but held. My mother was devastated, completely unequipped to deal with corporate law or shareholder disputes. Within months, she was told by Sterling and Wade, the firm handling our family's affairs after his death, that my father's ownership stake had actually been a loan, already repaid years earlier, and that we had no legal claim to any part of the company. Did she fight it? She tried. We didn't have money for a real legal battle against a firm that size. Every lawyer we consulted told us the paperwork looked airtight. We lost the house within a year. My mother's health broke down under the stress. Grief and financial ruin at the same time will do that to a person. She passed away when I was 25, still believing my father's legacy had simply evaporated, that maybe he really had made some quiet arrangement none of us ever knew about. But you didn't believe that. I never believed that, Naomi said, and for the first time, something fierce flashed behind the grief in her eyes. My father used to talk about this company like it was a second child. He would never have quietly given away his share without telling my mother, without telling me. So 4 years ago, once I'd finished my accounting degree working nights and weekends, I started digging. Public records, old newspaper archives, anything I could access without a lawyer's help. That's when I found the job posting for housekeeping staff at the Cross estate. You took a job cleaning my house to investigate a 30-year-old fraud. I took a job in the one place I might actually find the paper trail nobody had bothered to shred, Naomi said. I changed my name on the application. Hart was my mother's maiden name, hoping nobody would connect it. I never expected Vanessa to recognize Whitfield immediately. I think that's the moment she decided to keep me controlled instead of just firing me. Easier to watch an enemy up close than wonder what she's doing from a distance. Julian sat back slowly, absorbing the full shape of what she'd just described. 2 years of quiet, careful, exhausting patience, carried out in his own home, right under his nose, while he'd walked past her 1,000 times without ever really seeing her at all. I owe you an apology, he said finally. Not just for tonight. For 2 years of not once asking who you actually were. Naomi managed the faintest smile, tired but real. You're not the one who owes me an apology, Mr. Cross. Not yet. Not until we find out exactly what your father knew, and when he knew it. The next morning, Julian did something he hadn't done in over a decade. He cancelled every meeting on his calendar. He drove 2 hours to the private care facility where his father now lived, having handed daily operations of Cross Industries almost entirely to Julian the previous year following a stroke that had left Thomas Cross weaker but still sharp-minded. Julian brought the photograph with him, along with the incorporation documents, and set them both on the small table beside his father's chair without a word. Thomas Cross stared at the photograph for a long time before speaking. Robert Whitfield, he said finally, his voice rough. I haven't said that name out loud in almost 30 years. His daughter has been working in our house for 2 years, Dad. Cleaning our floors. Serving drinks at our parties. Because she was trying to find out what happened to her father's shares in this company. Thomas's jaw tightened, something like shame moving across his weathered face. It wasn't me, Julian. I want you to hear that clearly before anything else. I never touched Robert's shares. When he died, I was building the second manufacturing plant, buried in expansion, trusting our lawyers to handle the transition of his estate the way they'd handled everything else. Sterling and Wade. Yes. Marcus Sterling was more than our attorney, he was practically family friend by then. I trusted him completely. When he told me the paperwork had been settled, that Robert's widow had agreed to a buyout, that everything was documented and clean, I had no reason to question it. I was grieving my own partner, Julian. I didn't dig into the fine print of a man I trusted with everything. There was no buyout, Julian said. Naomi's mother never signed anything. She was told the shares had never existed at all, that it had only ever been a loan. Thomas Cross closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked every bit his 71 years. Then I have been living inside a lie for 30 years without knowing it, he said quietly. And an innocent family paid the price for my blind trust. We can fix this, Julian said. But I need to know if there's anything else you remember. Any paperwork, any conversation, anything at all that might help prove what actually happened. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached toward the drawer of his bedside table, hands trembling slightly, and withdrew a small, worn leather notebook Julian had never seen before. I kept a private ledger those first 10 years, he said. Every handshake deal, every verbal agreement we made before we could afford proper lawyers for everything. It's all in here, the original terms Robert and I agreed to, in his own handwriting on one of the pages, where he signed alongside me the night we opened the first warehouse. I never thought I'd need it as proof of anything. I kept it because it reminded me where we started. Julian took the notebook with careful hands, flipping to a page yellowed with age, and found it. 2 signatures, side by side, dated 35 years earlier, unmistakably real. T. Cross. R. Whitfield. Equal partners in belief, if not yet in bank accounts. This is everything, Julian breathed. This proves the original agreement existed independent of whatever Sterling and Wade filed later. Dad, this could be enough. Then take it, Thomas said, gripping his son's hand with more strength than Julian expected. Give that family back what should have always been theirs. And Julian, whatever this young woman went through to find the truth, whatever it cost her, make sure she knows the cross name still means something better than what was done to her father. The confrontation with Vanessa didn't come from Julian. It came from Vanessa herself, 3 days later, when she arrived at the Cross Industries headquarters demanding a private meeting, clearly having heard through the city's tightly connected legal circles that Julian had spent the week meeting with forensic accountants and outside counsel. She walked into his office with the same composed confidence she always carried, but something underneath it had shifted, a tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. I think we should discuss the engagement, she said, sitting down without being invited to. Before this spirals into something neither of us can walk back from. I already spoke to my father, Julian said, watching her carefully. He never touched Robert Whitfield's shares. He trusted your father completely to handle the paperwork after Robert died. And your father told him everything had been settled cleanly, with the family's agreement. My father passed away 4 years ago, Vanessa said quietly. You can't exactly ask him about decisions he made 3 decades ago. No, Julian agreed. But I can ask why the firm's filing records for that specific transaction are missing entirely from the archive, while every other filing from that same year is intact. I can ask why Naomi's mother has a certified letter, dated the same month, that never mentions any settlement or buyout at all, only a claim that no partnership had ever existed. 2 documents. 2 completely different stories. Someone built one of them to erase the other. Vanessa's composure cracked, just slightly, at the edges. You have no proof any of that involves me personally. I don't need proof it involves you personally, Julian said. I need proof it involves your father's firm, and it does. But I do find it strange, Vanessa, that out of every housekeeping applicant in this city, you specifically remembered the last name Whitfield the moment it crossed your desk, and specifically decided that woman's face needed to stay covered every day for 2 years. That's not the behavior of someone with nothing to hide. Vanessa said nothing for a long moment, staring at the surface of his desk like it might offer her an exit that didn't exist. I found out what my father did about 6 years ago, she finally admitted, voice low. Old firm records I stumbled across while helping settle his estate. He'd redirected Robert Whitfield's shares into a shell arrangement, then quietly folded the value into other client accounts over the years, including, eventually, into holdings that became part of my own inheritance. I didn't create the fraud, Julian. But I have been living off the profits of it for years, and I knew exactly what I was protecting the day I recognized that girl's application. The admission landed in the room like something physical. So every day for 2 years, Julian said slowly, you looked at a woman whose family you knew had been robbed, and instead of making it right, you made her hide her own face in the house her father helped build. I panicked, Vanessa said. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd figure out how to quietly correct it eventually, on my own terms, without blowing up my entire life. You had 2 years, Julian said. Naomi had 30. There was nothing left for Vanessa to say. She stood, smoothed the front of her blazer with hands that weren't quite steady, and walked toward the door. She paused there, one hand on the frame. For what it's worth, she said quietly, not turning around, I never expected to actually fall for the lie myself. I convinced myself I deserved what I had. That's a harder thing to admit than the fraud itself. Then she left, and the engagement between Julian Cross and Vanessa Sterling ended not with a headline, but with a quiet, unremarkable silence in an empty office. 3 weeks later, Cross Industries issued a formal, notarized restitution agreement. Quietly at first, then publicly, once Eleanor Ashworth, still furious on Naomi's behalf, made sure the story reached exactly the right ears in exactly the right social circles. Naomi Whitfield's family shares, adjusted for 35 years of growth and inflation, were restored in full, along with a formal public acknowledgement from Thomas Cross himself, stating plainly that Robert Whitfield had been an equal founding partner whose legacy had been wrongfully erased. Naomi didn't ask for headlines. She asked for something smaller, and in some ways, much larger, a modest plaque added beside the portrait in the mansion's front hallway, the same painting she used to stop and stare at every morning before her shift. It now read simply, founded by Thomas Cross and Robert Whitfield. Built on trust that was tested, and ultimately, restored. She kept working, for a little while, though not as a housekeeper. Julian offered her a position in the company's internal audit division, a job she was, as it turned out, remarkably overqualified for. She turned him down twice before finally accepting, insisting she wanted to earn the role on her own credentials, not out of guilt or sympathy. It was in that department, 6 months later, going over quarterly reports late on a Thursday evening, that Julian found himself lingering in her office doorway the way he used to linger near the kitchen, except now there was no veil between them, nothing hidden, nothing performed. You know, he said, you never actually told me why you chose accounting. Out of everything you could have studied. Naomi looked up from her screen, the ghost of a real smile, one he'd only recently started to recognize, tugging at the corner of her mouth. Because numbers don't lie, she said. People do. But numbers, if you know how to read them carefully enough, they always tell you the truth eventually. I learned that the hard way. I'm glad you didn't give up, Julian said quietly. 2 years, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the truth to surface. Most people would have walked away long before that. I almost did, Naomi admitted. More than once. But I kept thinking about my father, standing in front of that half-built warehouse, believing in something before anyone else did. I couldn't let that belief just disappear because it was inconvenient for someone else. Julian stepped further into the office, closer than strictly necessary for a conversation about quarterly reports. For what it's worth, he said, I think my father would have liked you. Not because of the shares, or the lawsuit, or any of it. Just, you. The way you refused to let go of the truth even when it would have been easier. Your father already told me that himself, Naomi said softly. Last week. He asked me to visit him, actually. Wanted to hear stories about my father that he never got to ask about while he still could. Julian's chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with something warmer, something he was only beginning to let himself feel. I'd like to hear those stories too, he said. Sometime. If you'd let me. Naomi looked at him for a long moment, the late afternoon light catching the same eyes that had once studied him carefully from behind a veil, cataloguing every detail of a house and a family she'd been quietly, patiently determined to understand. I think, she said finally, that could be arranged. A year after that night in the ballroom, the Cross Industries Foundation Gala returned, bigger than ever, hosted once again in the same mansion, under the same chandeliers. But this year, Naomi Whitfield walked through the front doors, not through the staff entrance, but through the grand double doors at the center of the house, her face uncovered, her head held high, wearing a deep blue gown instead of a grey uniform. She stood beside Julian Cross as his partner, in the company, and in life, greeting guests, including a beaming Eleanor Ashworth, who made absolutely certain to tell the story of the night the veil finally came off to anyone within earshot who hadn't already heard it 3 times. Somewhere in that crowd, quietly, without fanfare, a new plaque had been added to the ballroom wall, funded entirely by Naomi's restored shares. The Robert Whitfield Memorial Scholarship, established to support first-generation engineering students who, like her father once had, believed in something before anyone else was willing to. There's a lesson in this story that's easy to miss if you only focus on the twist, on the veil, on the shock of that one dramatic night. The real lesson is quieter than that. It's about how easy it is to look at someone and decide you already know their whole story, just from the surface. It's about how the people we overlook, the quiet ones, the ones doing the small, invisible work in the background, are so often carrying something far heavier and far more remarkable than we ever bother to imagine. Naomi Whitfield didn't need anyone to remove her veil to prove her worth. She always had it. It just took the world a little longer to actually see it. If this story moved you even a little tonight, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because there's a lot more coming. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that the truth always has a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how long it takes. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.